Do you often feel the pull to read more? I am constantly buying books because I want to read them, but then I leave them on my shelves unread. So I decided to experiment with a system to help me read more. And I've already found it so beneficial that I wanted to share it with you. And at the end of this video, I'm gonna talk about the next round of the Market Power Book Club. Yes! So this system was prompted by my new bookshelves. I love them. What do you think? I think they just look so good, and they look so much better in the video than the crappy IKEA shelves that I had there before. And even more exciting, they inspired me to do this experiment. That's because I had to move all those books off the old bookshelf and then figure out how I was going to organize them on this shelf. And as I was thinking about that organization, I realized that I could do more to experiment with reading. That's what prompted this 5-step experiment. The first step is to decide why you want to read. A lot of people want to read more, but they aren't always honest with themselves about what they're seeking. So before organizing my books, I decided to ask myself why I wanted to read more. Was I looking for entertainment? Was I trying to get a new skill? Was I seeking status in my social group? The more honest you are about your desires, the easier the next step is going to be. As I reflected on it, I decided that I wanted to read more because it's crucial to my success. As an economist and as a YouTuber, for me to do well, I need more ideas, facts, and theories. Reading is a crucial input to my production function. Step 2, create clusters of books. Clusters are just groups of books with a common theme, but the common theme is in line with your purpose. This idea was partially inspired by my recent reading of fantasy books. I just read the 4 books in the Stormlight Archives in one go. That's 4,500 pages of fantasy books without taking a break. The reason why it was so easy to read them together is because they're a series, they're related to each other. As you read the second book, you get throwbacks to the first book, you start to see the connections between books. It becomes incredibly exciting to read these books together. Now, most nonfiction books are meant to stand alone, but you can hack this system by creating your own series or a cluster of books. I worked with the books that I already own, but you could think about the system with the books that you are looking to read that you don't own yet. So you should cluster these books based on the purpose you decided in the first step. I decided my purpose was to get more ideas, facts, and theories. And as I looked at my books, I realized that there were ways to group these together to produce that goal. For example, I noticed I had a lot of books on both the history and the theory behind Chinese economic growth. So I put those all in a cluster with the plan to read those together. This system is full of surprises, and one of the surprises was realizing the areas where I could quickly learn something. I noticed I had about 3 to 4 books on Venezuelan history, so I turned that into its own cluster. Since these books are going to naturally connect with each other, reading them together is going to accelerate my learning. There are other surprises that came from the system, and I'll get to them at the end of the video, but let's get on to the next step. Step 3, pick a cluster and read at least 3 books in it. The cluster I decided to start with was one that I have named Paradigm Shifters. These were books meant to shift my worldview, or at least get me noticing patterns that I hadn't seen before. The 4 books that were in it were What You Do Is Who You Are, The Scout Mindset, Thinking Better, and The Status Game. You should have at least 3 books in that cluster. I have some clusters that have more than 3 books, and I don't have to read all of them at the same time. I have clusters that have less than 3 books, and I worry that I'm not going to find as many connections. In this cluster, if I had only read 2 books, I would not have noticed as many connections as I did by reading all 4 of them. But that's because this paradigm shifter cluster is a little looser than other clusters. Like if I had just 2 books on Venezuelan history, I might find more connections and it might be worth reading. But I think if you're going to have something loose, at least get 3 books so that way you can make it as likely as possible to get the connections that you want out of those books. Step 4, have a ritual for finishing each book. After each book, I ask 3 questions. First, I ask, how would I describe this book to a friend? For example, in The Scout Mindset, I would say that this is about challenging the way that we seek for truth. Julia Galef explains that we need to be like map makers when we're looking for truth, describing the land as it really is rather than as we wish it would be. My second question is, what are my biggest takeaways? In The Status Game, Will Storr explains how status games can shape our behavior. He describes how when we see something that gives somebody prestige, we want to copy that behavior so we can get some of that status. Incidentally, while I was reading this book, my 4-year-old daughter sat down next to me and started reading a book herself. Except she can't read. She saw me and knew that reading a book is something that gives me prestige, something that makes me her dad, and she wanted to copy that behavior. It was an incredibly powerful demonstration of what was in the book, and it's one of my biggest takeaways. The third question is to ask, how does this book connect to other books in the cluster? There was a pretty clear connection between these two books. In fact, there was a chapter in the status game that felt like it was the Scout mindset. Both of these books are arguing how status and identity can cause us to cling to beliefs rather than seeking out for truth. Now, for your ritual, you can copy these questions or you can come up with something else. Maybe you review every book that you read on Goodreads or on Amazon. Or maybe you think of a friend who would like this book and then you go talk to them and recommend it. Find whatever works for you to finish that reading experience. Step 5, find a way to be accountable to your purpose. In step 1, you found a purpose to reading, and in step 5, you need to make sure you're accomplishing that purpose. Don't make this too hard or else it will become a deterrent to your reading, and you can actually change it up every time. It doesn't have to be the same thing. For example, for the Paradigm Shifters, my accountability was writing an essay that I sent out to the Market Power newsletter. On books that I've read in the past, my accountability has been teaching either in class or here on YouTube. Or another way that you can be accountable is by joining a book club. That's right, the Market Power Book Club is opening up for a new round. I'm gonna talk about it in just a second, but first let me explain to you 2 surprises that I found as I was doing this experiment. The first surprise came when I was creating the clusters, and I discovered that there were some books that didn't have a cluster. I have a book on Iceland's history that I'm really interested in reading because I have Icelandic ancestry, but I couldn't find another book that this would fit well with that would make it a good cluster. Similarly, I have this book on Indian economic history and economic policy. I'm interested in reading this as well, and maybe I could put these two together, make it like a world history cluster or a countries that start with I cluster. I don't know how I would put them together. I don't feel like these would benefit that much being read together, but it now puts me on the lookout for other books that I could be reading and put into this cluster. It actually makes it more intentional. Instead of picking up whatever book somebody recommends to me, I am now saying, what am I going to read to make these books more beneficial? The second surprise was realizing that I need to stop reading a book as soon as I realized that it does not fit with the cluster. So I included Thinking Better in my cluster of paradigm shifters. As I was reading it, I realized it wasn't as much of a paradigm shifter or changing my worldview as I thought. It's like Freakonomics for math, and I really liked it. I would give it to probably a high school student who was really good at math or a college freshman who was thinking about majoring in math. But in terms of, is this shifting the way that I see the world or changing the patterns that I see in the world, it just wasn't fitting with that cluster. So about halfway through, I decided to stop reading it. And that's good because the best way for you to read more is to read less. That means you have to read less of the books that are not contributing to your purpose. Otherwise, you'll get stuck and you won't want to read anymore. You need to be focused on that purpose, and you need to recognize what that purpose is in step 1. So that's why you need to establish that so you can create your clusters and then realize when they're working and when a book is not, and just go on to the next one. And I'm so glad I did, because the next book that I read was The Status Game, and that was totally worth dropping this book to read. Okay, we are on to book club. Enrollment for the next book club is open. It's 6 books in 6 months with a monthly call and an online discussion board. I'm taking the lessons I learned from the first round and applying them to this one to make it even better. If you want to see which books we're reading, when we're meeting, and how to sign up, go ahead and check in the link that I'm going to put right next to the subscribe button. And if you're interested in more recommendations on reading, go ahead and check out this video here.